Right. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone here today to our final Practical Theology Guild for McMaster Divinity College. And today we've got Professor John Swinton with us as our guest speaker. I want to just tell a little bit about some of John's background. That he's Professor Swinton is the Chair of Divinity and Religious Studies, Professor of Practical Theology and Pastoral Care at King's College, University of Aberdeen. He's also the founding director of the Aberdeen Centre for Spirituality, Health and Disability, which began in 2004. In 2016, Professor Swinton received the award for the Michael Ramsey Prize for Theological Writing for his book, Dementia, Living in the Memories of God. In 2020, he received the Lanfranc Award for Education and Scholarship by the Archbishop of Canterbury. And in 2022, he was appointed a chaplain for Her Majesty in Scotland. Professor Swinton's written many, many books. I'm not going to list the names of all of them. He's also written many journal articles, prolific writer. And some of the topics have been on dementia, on adoption, end-of-life care, disability, and the topic of evil. And the last three books that you've written have been Finding Jesus in the Storm, which was written in 2020, and Deliver Us from Evil in 2022, and Walking with Jesus in Strange Places in 2022. And so I just wanted to welcome you here, John. I'm so glad you're able to make it today.
Well, I'm glad I was able to make it too.
I know your schedule is very busy and you questioned whether you could fit it in or not. So we're thankful you could take the time and fit it in to be with us.
Oh, no, it's a pleasure.
Yeah. And so I wanted to ask you a few questions. First half of our time together is going to be me asking you a few questions. And the second half, I'm going to turn over to Sean, and he's going to take questions from the people in the audience here. And so I'd like to begin. My first question is that many of us know your work because of the work in practical theology and in the research of qualitative research methods. And when I was corresponding with you, you mentioned that there's a growing interest in using qualitative research methods with an overtly theological intention, which is a movement away from correlational models. I was wondering if you could just speak about that a bit to explain that shift and what's happening.
Yeah, well, I mean, practical theology is constantly shifting and changing in terms of its method and approach. When I began my university life, it was basically handy household hints for ministers. So you'd be taught how to preach, how to teach, how to apply certain forms of historical or systematic theology. But then, round about the 70s, things began to change, and there was the kind of correlational model of practical theology began to develop. And so within correlation, you're bringing together theology and some other form of knowledge, maybe psychology, for example. And in that conversation, you work out both what theology is and what psychology is in relation to the thing you're talking about. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, even with the revised critical correlation model, which actually gave both voices an equal say in the conversation. Mm-hmm. But there's a number of theologians that are uncomfortable with that, in the sense that, is it the case that psychology can or should trump theology in a conversation? Which weighting do we give to each side of that conversation? And how do we not end up with just a psychologized theology rather than a theological understanding of psychology? So these conversations have gone on within practical theology for some time. But recently there's been a kind of movement towards what's described as theological ethnography. So theological ethnography, as you said, Janet, is to do with overtly using theology in your social scientific reflection as theology rather than simply as a dialogue partner, which could go either way. And so if you think about it this way, if systematic theology looks reflectively at the history and tradition of the church and comes to certain dogmatic conclusions about what we should believe and what we shouldn't believe and how we should practice, theological ethnography accepts that and works with that, but then asks the question, what is God doing in the world today? And that's not simply an application of theology. It's actually a challenge sometimes to establish ways of thinking about theology, because as soon as you get into qualitative research, as soon as you look at what the church is doing today, a different set of questions begins to emerge. Right. So my area of disability theology is a good example of that. So you find yourself looking at a situation, say something like dementia, and then you're immediately faced with the question, what does it mean to love and to know God when you've forgotten who God is? You take that back to the tradition, and you realize nobody's ever asked that question before. So you begin to ask that question, and you begin to get different ways of understanding the tradition. Well, this is it's like if you look at a diamond from different perspectives, you'll see different things. And it's like that. So it's not a push against orthodoxy, it's a different way of expanding our understanding, asking different sets of questions. And so rather than allowing the social sciences to take the lead, theology takes the lead in working out the analysis and the way of thinking about what's going on within that situation. So that's kind of how that way of thinking runs.
Okay. So in your book, Finding Jesus in the Storm, would you have used that? Was that the methodology you used in that book?
No. Yes.
I thought you had.
It is. That's a good example. So in relation to that book, it's a phenomenological study of the experiences of Christians who live with mental health challenges. And so the basic philosophical structure is phenomenology, within which the intention is to put to one side your assumptions and presuppositions about what it is you're looking at and try to get to the thing in and of itself. So in the context of mental health, to put to one side the implications of diagnosis and what you might expect from a diagnosis, like say schizophrenia or whatever it is you may be thinking about, putting that to one side and listening to people's stories as they are, and using qualitative research to enable and facilitate that story to come to the fore. That's not to suggest that everything that we know about mental health challenges is wrong. It's to say that we are all kind of drawn into the very powerful language of psychiatry, which shapes and forms the way that we look at one another, look at people who have particular names and diagnoses. By putting that to one side, you really get into the story. And when you get into the story, then you get into the theology of the story, because you begin to realize that things like symptoms are actually deeply meaningful experiences, and very often deeply meaningful experiences that have theological significance. So yes, I did use that.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that book. And I wanted to ask you a question, actually, of something that you said in that book that really impacted me. You said about that mental health challenges are difficult experiences, but they needn't prevent us from living well, living faithfully, and loving Jesus. Can you expand on that? Because you talked about that a bit in the book, and I thought it'd be good to draw that out a bit.
Well, I think one of the challenges that we have in relation to mental health issues, and also in relation to disability issues, is that there's a temptation to frame them in the context of pastoral care, right? So somebody has this particular set of experiences. We need to work out what kind of pastoral care do we have so they can get better in that sense. But that makes, there's lots of difficulties with that. But one difficulty with that is that the temptation then is to make these a side issue for people who are interested in these kind of things. I think a better frame for thinking about mental health and thinking about disability is in terms of discipleship. So rather than asking the question, how can we help this person to get better? Because I mean, everybody needs pastoral care, so that's nothing wrong with that. The question is, this person has a vocation, has a calling from God to do something. What is it that they're called to God to do in this particular situation as they work their way through this experience? And so when you're thinking in terms of discipleship rather than simply in terms of pastoral care, which is kind of like a given, then you begin to see that these experiences are actually profoundly revealing of the nature of God and nature of discipleship, but also they call us to a difficult ministry within which we have to help people who are going through difficult situations to find their vocation and to find their way towards health. But of course, one of the key issues in there is what the nature of health is. And so when we talk about health very often, particularly in the highly medicalized society, cultures like our own, you think about health as the absence of illness, right? And so you're going to, you have health here and then you have illness here. But of course, that simply means that many people are going to be ill forever, and that would be part of it. To have part of who you are as simply ill forever is a really difficult way for people to live. And one of the things that I try to push on in the book that you're talking about is that a biblical understanding of health doesn't require cure. It doesn't require that we get fixed and mended. What it requires is that we can find, even in the midst of the wildest of storms, we can find a way to hold on to Jesus in the midst of that. And the task of the Christian community is to enable people to do that in difficult times. So it's quite a different model of health that underpins that. And I think that's what the church brings to the table of mental health, that particular understanding of health and that particular understanding of healing, which doesn't require getting rid of things, actually requires finding things and holding on to things, things spiritual.
I really enjoyed reading about when you explained the difference between being cured and being healed.
Yeah.
The cured was having the illness being gone, but the healed was that shalom with God, having the peace. It was really good. Thank you. In your book called Walking with Jesus in Strange Places, you wrote something that was very interesting, that you said, contrary to what we often assume, Jesus did not sit with those on the margins of society. Rather, he moved the margins. God was on the margin and offering friendship, which is so different for many of us who are working with people who have disabilities. We do have that phrase where we say, we're going to come and sit with you. We're going to come and be with you. So it's interesting to say that, and we bring that because we think, well, that's what Jesus offers. That's what Jesus has done. But you're saying here that contrary to what we often assume, Jesus didn't sit with those on the margins of society. Rather, he moved the margins. Can you just address that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that sometimes it's very easy to forget that Jesus is God. And so it's very easy to turn Jesus into kind of like a good social worker or somebody who just hangs around with people who are on the margins of society, which is, of course, is true. However, the thing is that Jesus, who is God, sits with the marginalized and changes the boundaries of the margins. So no longer are the marginalized the space where the boundaries begin or end. Actually, it's over here that people are sitting in the marginalized. That is the wealthy, the people who think they're in the right relationship with God, the people who form civil and political society, religious society. These are the guys and girls that are marginalized. Now the margins are over here. And I think that's for me, that's a really important observation. And also very important for the contemporary church to keep in mind, is that the social location of Jesus determines where God is. And the social location of the church determines whether the church is with God in that space. And so I think to forget that challenge, that Jesus shifts the margins, and that's where God does his redemptive work. To forget that these things is to misplace yourself within society and to risk being outside of the boundaries of what God is doing.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. I really resonated when as I've read it. And the last question I have for you is, in your book, Becoming Friends of Time, there are two phrases that really kind of stood out to me. And the first one was the practices of love. And so for all of us who are DPT students here at the school, part of our thesis, we have to write about a practice. And so when you talked about this practices of love, it kind of really just echoed over and over. And I paused many times and thought about it and thought about, what does that really mean, these practices of love? And the second phrase you gave was that the love of God is something we live into. And I thought, for me as an evangelical, charismatic, Pentecostal person, I understand about the love of God coming and surrounding me, and I understand about feeling the love of God. But to say that it's something we live into, I thought I'd like you to expand on those two concepts more, to explain what you meant in the book when you said them.
Yeah, well, when Scripture tells us that God is love, that's really, really important, because if we're going to claim to know God, then we need to think about what it means to love and to love God, right? Now, I'm a good Presbyterian boy, so therefore everything comes through words. Your salvation comes through words, preaching comes through words, everything's through words, which makes it a real challenge when you encounter people that don't have words in that sense. And there's all sorts of things that go on to try to get around what that means. But when I say when I said there in relation to what God is, think about it this way: James says very clearly that the demons know more about God than you do. Go out and look after the widows and the orphans. In Jeremiah 22:16, you have something very similar. Jeremiah's talking about King Josiah, who's a good king. Why is he a good king? Because he looks after the widows and orphans. And then Walter Brueggemann reflects on that passage, and he points out that after that, it says, is that not what it means to know me? To look after the widows and the orphans, is that not what it means to know me? In other words, knowing God is a social practice. It's not something we do with our minds simply. It's a social practice, a way of being in the world in that sense. And what Jeremiah says is not that you come to know God and then you do good things. Actually, looking after the widows and the orphans is part of what it means to know God and to love God in that sense. And so if you think about love as a social practice in that way, that it's something that we do with our bodies as well as our minds, it's something we live into because our bodies are living their way through the world, if you like, then you can begin to see that to proclaim the love of a God who is love is much more than an intellectual concept. It's a whole way of being. And so I think that's really what I mean by both of these phrases and expressions in different ways.
Well, thank you. That's helps me to understand what you're talking about. It was great. I really enjoyed reading that book. I think I want to turn it over to Sean now, and that we can open up for questions from the rest of the audience. But thank you, John, for allowing me to interview.
You're welcome.
Hi, John.
Hi, Sean.
So for everyone, if you have any questions that you would like to ask John, you can raise your hand using the reactions button in Zoom, and you can ask him about anything that he said, anything that he will say, any book that he's written. All topics are on the table, we can say. But I have a few questions for you, John, just to sort of prime our pumps for, as other people form their questions. You can correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is that you moved from being a practitioner to a researcher. And I'm wondering about that journey, how that journey came about and how your practice continues to inform the research that you're doing.
Well, that is a good question. So, so I began my professional life as a nurse. So I nursed for 16 years, originally in the area of mental health, and then I retrained and worked in the area of intellectual disability, which then was called mental handicap, and then became learning disabilities. These names shift and change as culture shifts and change, which is a conversation in itself. And so all of my early formative years as a healthcare professional helped me to see the world in a particular way, because if you're spending time with people who see the world differently, people who have visions and dreams, or people who get really depressed, or people who don't have words, when you spend a lot of time with that, it shapes and forms you to look at things in a quite particular way. So when I decided to leave nursing and go into chaplaincy, that formation shaped and formed my theological career. So there was no particular reason why I left. I enjoyed nursing. I just came to a stage where I thought, I've done this for a long time. I've enjoyed it. It's time to do something else. And I thought I would end up in chaplaincy. And I did work in chaplaincy for a few years as a mental health chaplain. But as soon as I got to university, I knew I wanted to teach practical theology. I finished my degrees and I did that. But the questions that emerged from my formation as I moved into my new vocation was shaped and formed the way I did theology, simply because I as I said earlier on, I came at it from a different angle. I had a different set of questions from most of the questions that were being asked within the academy at that moment in time. Thankfully, that shifted and changed. And so I had, from a professional point of view, I had a space that I could make my own, but I also had a passion for it because I'd seen how difficult it is for people to engage with the church when they're going through difficult experiences. Simply because the church, as part of society, can be equally as stigmatized and equally as misunderstanding, if that's the way to put it, as the rest of society. So I knew there was a need there, but I knew there was a challenge. So when I came into the academy, it was my opportunity to ask these questions and to face that challenge and to help the church to be as faithful as possible within these particular areas.
So I see those hands. I have a follow-up question with that, because you're sort of talking about the difficulty of engaging the church, and while the shifts and changes in language is really interesting to me, in terms of the dissertation work that I'm doing. But it seems to me that sort of C.S. Lewis talks about in-group, out-group language, and in fields of academia, you can have this in-group language that's very complex and short form that everyone knows what you're talking about. But then when you try to bring it back in the church, instead of using one word, you have to use 10 or 20 words to say the same thing. Right. And so I'm wondering if you have any strategies for translating your work into different contexts, from the discipline of practical theology into sort of a parish that you might be speaking to, or a conference of pastors, or any other context.
Yeah, I don't know if I've had any tips. I mean, in the sense that I've never really found it very difficult to communicate things I have a passion for, and I think that one of the difficulties with theological language is exactly that you say. It's sometimes distantiated. It's sometimes not very well written. It's convoluted. It's confusing, and the reason for that is because theologians are like that. It's like a badge of honor. If you can make your work completely understandable only to 6 other people, then it's fantastic. Like, it must be really good. Nobody can challenge you. But then you and I are left with the challenge. Well, these are really important questions. How do we communicate that? And so one of the things that I do with my colleagues is, my systematic theologians, and I love systematic theology, so I'm not in any sense pushing against it. But I'll say to them, like, okay, we have a doctrine of the Trinity, right? So what does it look like? Ask that question. It's really interesting, like, because many people think it should look like anything. Many think it's like a clock that should sit in the mantelpiece and look beautiful and turn around, but not really tell the time. So you construct fantastic things, but don't tell them the time. And so the short answer to your question is, speak to issues, speak to things of a passion, because that you have a passion about, and allow your language to open up new spaces in people's imagination that they haven't really thought about before. And you don't have to be complicated or clever to do that. You just have to have the right set of questions. You have to have the right way of thinking about it, and challenge yourself to with the question, okay, I understand this doctrine, but what's it done for me? What does it look like in my life? And then what does it look like in the life of the church? And so just that's that way of question, kind of like the way that Jesus does. When Jesus teaches through questioning and opening up people's imagination. So I think that's kind of the space to be in. But above all else, you need to be humble. And I don't mean that patronizing. You just have to say, I'm an academic, but that's all I am. But I'm bringing some things that I hope will be helpful for you. And then just give your gifts.
That's great. Thank you. That's, yeah, really fantastic. Jonathan.
Hi there. Thanks for being with us, John. I have a question about methodology. I'm doing my dissertation on a trauma-informed study of the Eucharist. And so I'm curious how the methodology that I've outlined would line up with theological ethnography as you've described it. I'm not really using a correlationist approach. I'm drawing on Karen O'Donnell's description of constructive theology, but with a key sort of theological recalibration in that trauma is not just a lens through which we read scripture or we look at the crucifixion or the life of the church, but situating Christ as the fundamental point of reference theologically. And so I'm kind of drawing on the domain-based approach to integrating Christianity and psychology by Hathaway and Yarhouse, a recent 2021 book, and they identify worldview, theoretical, applied, role, and personal domains. So like on the theoretical domain, theology and psychology or psychological traumatology can kind of go back and forth a bit, but it's essential that we ground this in Christian worldview, such that I would want to say that Christ ultimately defines, or perhaps using a biblical term, fulfills trauma as a human being. So I'm trying to, I think similarly, I'm not doing qualitative research, but I'm trying to similarly take something like, here's a body of knowledge regarding psychological traumatology, but situate it within fundamentally Christian worldview and assumptions, and then work within that. Does that sound similar to you, or like what might be key differences that you see there?
No, that's very similar. I mean, I think the way that I would think about it is to make sure that you're make sure you get on the right plane, right? So if you're jumping on a plane in, I don't know, Toronto, and you want to go to Spain, but you don't want to get on the plane that's going to Portugal, right? And I think sometimes theology works that way, that we begin with a secular definition of a phenomenon. So sticking with psychology, a secular definition of counseling, for example, right? And then we build our theology on top of that, and then we come to theological conclusions, forgetting that underneath that is the doctrine of creation. So counseling, even before counseling has begun, God was. So counseling always takes place within the context of creation. So it's always a secondary discipline, a secondary conversation. If we forget that, then you will build your theology on top of that, but you're building your theology on top of human knowledge rather than on top of how you understand divine knowledge to be. And that in itself is a complicated and controversial question. So when it comes to the kind of areas you're thinking about in terms of trauma, underpinning the contemporary theories of trauma is theology. And so, and you might find that quite difficult, because somebody like Karen, who I think is great, might not begin from that perspective. She may have a different, because she has a different perspective on what theology is, right? And so that also is a key question. What do we mean when we talk about theology? And secondly, what kind of knowledge is theology? And these are fundamental questions. But I suspect, listening to the way you described your study, that you're not really taking Karen's position on theology, but you're taking some of her ideas and concepts around trauma. So thinking through what your theological basis is before you engage with the other discipline, I think, is the key to holding that together.
Okay, yeah, that's very helpful. And I'm trying to do that mainly through John Baer and his interpretation of Irenaeus on human personhood and sin and salvation and those sorts of things. So yeah, that's great. Thanks, John.
I met John Baer the other day because he works with us, but I hadn't really met him because of COVID, and he's really tall, huge.
I didn't know that.
It's like everybody you meet in Zoom is either much smaller or much taller than you. He's giant.
Funny.
Yes, as someone who is 5 feet 18 inches, I feel that deeply. Stefan, go ahead.
Dr. Swinton, it's a privilege to have you with us today. I think I, like many of us on this call, are relying on your co-authored book, Practical Theology and Qualitative Research, as a foundation for work that we're doing. And I have a question about my own research, but I'm going to frame it in a way that I think how you respond might be helpful to others on this call as well. So I feel like, so I'm doing focus group interviews with congregants in a variety of churches this summer. And I've been a pastor for 20 years. I've done a lot of informal practical theological research and trying to listen to my own parishioners. But this will be the first time in my life I ever, for a dissertation, do sort of formal kind of focus group interviews, and I'll have them recorded and transcribed and use NVivo software to code and analyze and so on and so forth. And I feel like I've been well trained at McMaster Divinity College in the foundations, and have read a lot about how to do focus groups and so on. And I will be doing a pilot study first at my own church that won't really officially count for the research, just to make sure I have all my ducks in a row. So if someone's doing hands-on practical theological research in a formal way for the first time ever in their life, and they feel like they're kind of grounded and been well educated, but I don't know, would you, any practical tips, any things about a mindset to go into with this with, or anything that comes to your mind and says, here's some advice that from my own experience?
You mean in terms of using your qualitative research and the qualitative research process?
Well, there's so many aspects to it. Like I'm concerned about, I'm having pastors of churches help me recruit participants into my focus groups. So I'm concerned about, will I get enough participants? But then will I do, I know in my head, but will I do a good job of asking the right questions? Will I do a good job of being a good listener? There's like technical knowledge, but there's also a disposition you need to have. And I just wondered if you have any advice in any of those broad areas. When
Well, the first thing I would say is you need to practice before you preach, if you like. So if you're running focus groups, you would be wise to get together with some friends and test out your questions, but also test out your interview skills. So people that you trust and know, get them to tell you how they feel when you talk to them, because what you've got to remember, it's always very important, is that any interview is a co-creation. So it's a conversation, but it's created by both of you. And so your body language, your ways of responding, obviously, ultimately, your questions shape and form the kind of knowledge that you will get. So I think testing that out, and that process of testing out will also increase your confidence. The second thing is keep a reflexive diary. So reflexivity is fundamentally important. And in that diary, ask yourself questions like, why did I respond in this way and not in that way? Why is it I really didn't like that participant? Chances are it probably reminds you of somebody, maybe your friend, or if you're a Freudian, your father, whatever it is. So keep a note of your emotions, your feelings, and in that way, because that's part of your data. And use that as a way of monitoring your progress. And if one of your interviews ends up with a disaster, it's still data. Everything's data, because there's a reason for that. And even in disastrous interviews, you get things that are useful. So begin to get that mindset of everything is data, but I need to monitor myself. I need to practice this in the same way as I can practice anything else. And then ultimately, having the confidence and the boldness to make decisions, particularly when it comes to your analysis, because you're going to have to take somebody else's story and make it your own. I don't mean that, well, I do mean that, exactly that, because you ask the questions, so therefore you're looking for something, you decide which pieces of text are going to be used, which pieces are not, in that sense. So that analytical process is important, but you have to be bold, and you have to be honest with yourself, and you have to be reflexive. And depending on what kind of verification system that you want to use, you may well want to have that conversation again with the groups of people that you're talking to, in terms of feedback. So that's one way of checking. The member checking is helpful. The disadvantage of member checking is, people do it for a lot of reasons, but the disadvantage is that people change their minds. And so somebody will say something to you one day, and then next day they'll say, "Oh, I never said that," or "I never meant that," or they'll see it in writing and think, "Oh, I don't like the look of that." So with qualitative research, all you get is a little snapshot of this moment in time. interview the same people, the next day you'll get something different. So my general sense in terms of verification is, if you feel that member checking is the thing you intuitively want to do, then you should do that. But there are problems with it, and don't want to do that. Other ways of verifying your data that don't involve that. These would be the kind of things I would suggest you keep in mind.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful.
Doug.
Dr. Swinton, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to hear you today. So thank you for your time. When you were sharing about disability, just an offhand comment, I came across a title, a book I haven't read yet, but it resounded with what you were saying. It's Amy Kenny, and she's written a book. She's a disability activist. The title of her book is "My Body Is Not a Prayer Request."
Yeah.
And I just thought that resounded nicely with what you were saying about discipleship. My question may be a little bit of a repeat of what Jonathan has asked, but I'm a person that benefits from hearing things twice. Theological ethnography, the research I'm doing lends itself to critical correlational method, sort of a side-by-side comparison of a social science theory, Bowen family systems theory to be specific. Bowen family systems theory arose out of a purely secular psychiatric context. It has no claim to theological base, makes no presumption to do so, yet it's used quite extensively in a church context. I was wondering if you might speak to what, or speak further to what taking a theological lead instead of a sort of side-by-side posture might end up looking like, a theological ethnography for a social science that has made no claim to any sort of divine relationship whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's welcoming is that social scientific theories have their own, arguably, certainly their own spirituality, but they definitely possibly their own theology as well. In other words, there's built-in beliefs that underpin many. So something like the theory you're working with, there's particular beliefs about what the nature of family is, what the nature of community is, and what the nature of relationships are. So you already have some key issues that you have to buy into in order to understand and use that theory in its natural habitat. So my sense would be that you would need to ask, or you should be asking, critical theological questions, such as, does the nature of community and social relationships is assumed by this theory, does that match the theological understandings of family and relationships and community that you know and understand? There's no reason why you still can't use the theory, but what you have to do is to highlight, or maybe it's a bit better way of putting it, is a process of conscientization. You know, that idea from liberation theology where you raise your consciousness to issues that you can't see normally, and when you see them, you think, "Oh yes, right." So you engage with through that process of conscientization, so that you're able to minimize any misleading dimensions of that theory that might ultimately impact upon the way in which you theologize, and impact, therefore, on the faithfulness of your overall project. So I'm not in any sense saying get rid of the social sciences. I'm simply saying be a little bit more suspicious and recognize that inherent morality and theological structure that sits within many of the assumptions.
Thank you.
Great, Beth.
Hi there. Thanks so much for being with us. I found your work so helpful. My question is more around those of us who are emerging as practical theologians outside the church, in terms of paid positions within the church or academia. So I'm a nurse, and so my question is more, what advice would you give someone like me, who I have no sense of a strong call to be in paid ministry in a church, although I've done lay ministry my entire life. and I want to stay within my vocation, although retiring probably before too long. But what would you say to people who want to do practical theology from a place outside sort of those traditional places of church and academy?
So you definitely should do it. The idea of vocation is obviously historically is complicated, but I always like the way that Luther thinks about vocation as the things that God calls you to do in the service of God's neighborly love. Right, and so your vocation is not simply to ministry in a formal sense. It's wherever you are, that's your vocation. So, and also the interesting idea that you have several vocations. You have a vocation to your work, your nursing. You have a vocation to your family. You have a vocation to a variety of different things, which shift and change over time. And so when you get to your old age, your vocation is different than it was when you're in the 20s. So rather than being a career plan, it's actually a series of events that participate and help us to participate faithfully in God's enduring love. So the PhD program that we have here, which runs, it's a distance learning program actually, and we have students who normally wouldn't be able to travel because they're in work, but who want to use their particular work context as the place for theological reflection. And so on that program, you have people who are nurses or social workers, some people who are ministers, some people who are business people, who simply take this as an opportunity to use the structures and frameworks of practical theology to look at their work, their vocation at that moment in time, and to use that as the space. And so you begin to discover then that vocation actually is certainly has a particular shape and form when you think about it within the church, but actually when you think about it in the world, it also has a very powerful and important shape and form. So there's no particular reason why your vocation as a nurse can't be the space where you do theology.
I guess my question more is, how do you find a voice in that, right? It's a little bit easier, I think, to find a voice if you're already in the church and you have lots of connections within your church or whatever, or in the academy. But if outside those spheres, I think in some ways it seems a little harder to find a voice.
I guess it would depend on who you were speaking to, who you wanted to speak to. So when you talk about having a voice, who would you want to use that voice to communicate with?
Probably like colleagues, right, within nursing, but also I guess more the church in general, but more geared to the lay person, I think, than encouraging them to live out their vocation and wherever God has placed them to help with the flourishing of the world where they are.
Well, yeah, I think you certainly, as a Christian, have a voice within the healthcare service, but to be able to take the kind of research you're doing and the kind of ideas you're thinking about and help people to understand what they look like within that context, which is quite difficult sometimes. But I guess the only way that you can take your voice as somebody who's in your is to write, and to write specifically for a popular audience, to write for people. Work out who it is you want to voice for. That's the space where you need to write into, because that's probably the only way that you can take the kind of academic work that you're doing and communicate it to other people, is through writing, through finding spaces. Apart from, unless you want to start a podcast, which is actually a very good way of doing it. So I guess just begin to write it out, begin to think about who's my audience, and how can I reach them, and what kind of writing do I need to do that. But on a day-to-day basis, you're surrounded, I'm sure, by colleagues that you could have these kind of conversations with, in principle.
Thank you.
Great. So we just to clarify, we have Lee, Uriah, and then Lisa, and Lisa will have the last question for the day. Lee, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, let me just add my thanks to you, John, for giving us this hour of your time. We sure appreciate it. My question is just a quick one, maybe, that so as you know, you're talking to a group of doctoral students doing professional docs or PhD. As you work with students, what's just when you're maybe having your first meeting or early in their time as working on their doctorate, what are a couple things as a supervisor you try and offer them as ways to think about, you know, how's this process going to work and how's it going to be successful? And here's some ideas that I think you just need to know to kind of get through this program successfully. Do you have any wisdom or thoughts or ways that you work with your students that you like to sort of set them up with at the start or even as they're going through the program?
Well, that's a good question. The thing is with students is that every student learns differently. And so there's a general approach where you give people information and you begin to help people to recognize that the pain and the panic that they're going through is shared by everybody at that stage. So that sense of lostness, but these are good kind of pastoral skills. But not everybody functions in the same way. So some students you have to be really, really critical with, right? So they give you a piece of work and you need to really tell them this is off, really red pen time. Other students, if you did that, you'd break them. Other students because some students love that. It's the only way they can function, and some students can't do that. So what I find you need to do is to work out how people learn best and how people feel safest in the kind of feedback that you're going to give to them, and then give that to them in that form. Like, even though you might feel, you know, this is the worst piece of work ever, then don't say that. But you can say it to him or her, but not to him. But you work that over time, not just with the students that you have, but you learn to understand what students are going through, and then being able to give them what they need at that particular moment in time as they move through the whole process. So that's the way I think about it. It's just you have to get to know people and get to know the learning styles, get to know what they can and cannot tolerate, and most importantly, get them through. Because it's their journey, and it's for many people, it's more than a journey, it's their passion. And my job is to help their passion to come to conclusion so that they can do good things in the world. So it's a very kind of intimate relationship in that sense. And over time, you get to know people, but you also get to know personality types. So you can kind of work out quite early what will work and what won't work. So that's kind of the beginning point for lots of things.
Great, helpful. Thanks, John.
Uriah.
Thank you so much for joining us. My interest is in the area of spiritual formation, and particularly looking at spiritual formation from the perspective of learning theory. The danger in that is to reduce spiritual formation to, cognitive learning. I think it's much more than that. I think it includes our mystical experiences of God, which can be instructive. It's our life within community. A lot of that is tacit learning that we don't necessarily articulate, and so on. But as we look at sort of models and descriptions of the process of learning, they're only valid if they work for, say, people with cognitive disabilities or profound cognitive disabilities. And so spiritual formation then becomes kind of different in some respects in that context. And I know you've done a lot of important work in that area. And maybe as a general question, what would you say about spiritual formation for persons with cognitive disabilities, or who are non-communicative or have profound cognitive disabilities? How is the process of spiritual formation different? How do we, as people within their community, contribute to their spiritual formation and discipleship? How do we journey with them in that context? Somewhat general question, but what are your insights in that area?
Well, my initial thought would be that spirituality and spiritual formation is something we do with the whole of our bodies. So whereas as Westerners, we tend to be tied up with cognition, that we have to learn certain things in order to be certain kinds of people. But actually beyond if you think about it, something like 70% of the things that we learn going through life, we learn without words. We learn it as we relate with one another. It's a very small percentage of our overall formation that comes through words. And it's as we interact with one another, we develop relationships, as we become embodied beings, right from childhood right through to the whole life process. we're constantly learning, we're constantly interrelating, and we're constantly being shaped and formed by not just what the knowledge that we have, intellectual, but by the ways in which we use our bodies, the ways in which we engage with one another, which is really brought to, you can really see that quite clearly in relation to people with dementia, for example, many people who have advanced dementia who no longer have any memory, at least recall memory, but their bodies still remember things. Their bodies still remember the shape of worship, the shape of prayer, the feelings of the encounters within the Christian community. And so you can see that, just to go back to the point earlier on, love is a practice. And so when it's somebody who has a profound cognitive disability, who will never know the name of Jesus, there's no particular reason why they can't feel the love of Jesus. Now, I don't think God is so tied up in himself or God's self that he has to be named, otherwise it doesn't work. I think that the relationships we have within the body of Christ are profoundly important. And when Paul talks about the body of Christ, the thing that first of all marks out the body of Christ is difference. Everybody's different, but also everybody doesn't do the same things. So yes, you might remember, but that's not my job. Yes, you might be really, really clever, but that's not my job. What is your job? Well, my job is to be. And so there's a real challenge there in that. So spiritual formation in that sense has a bodily, a communal, a relational dimension that I think sometimes gets forgotten about, because you and I may well forget all the clever things that we've been taught over the years. But the key is, are we then unable to be formed? And the answer is no, we're not.
That's great. Thank you.
And Lisa.
I wanted to read you a couple of sentences from Raging with Compassion that I had underlined and starred. Theodicies that use the doctrine of original sin to explain evil and suffering silence the voice of the innocent victim and choke the cry of lament. When theodicy functions in such a way, it becomes a source of evil rather than an explanation of it. I would, I wish that could be tattooed on every student pastor's forehead. I think so many of our modern understandings of evil, of suffering, of sufferers have been inadequate, and so many sufferers have been, bludgeoned by our pastoral attempts at Romans 8:28. I'm interested in disability ministries and have done some work in that area, and just wondered if you would comment on, for those of us who suffer, how practical theology can be used as a methodological framework, particularly about addressing ableism in the church, and that strand of ableism that says those of us who are disabled are recipients of care, but not givers of care. Not that those of us with disabilities need to be ministered to, rather than offering ministry to the healthy, wealthy, able-bodied folks among us.
Exactly. I think that we need to be much more oriented to the way in which we tend to ignore parts of Scripture and prize other parts of Scripture. So, for example, think about Moses when he gets his vocation, right? So Moses gets his vocation, and he says to God, "Well, I can't do it. I've got a stutter." Right? So God, what does God do? Does he say, "Oh, wait a minute, I'll heal your stutter, and then you can go"? He says, "Go and do what you're told." But then, even more mysteriously, he says, "Who do you think does these things? Who makes people unable to speak? Who makes people?" But I don't know what that means. But at a minimum, it means that God's implicated in disability in mysterious ways. And anybody that says, "Well, this is just because of the fall," or whatever we say it, that passage says, well, maybe there's something more to going on here than that. Likewise, when it comes to Paul's thorn in his flesh, right? So Paul's got this thorn in his flesh. Nobody really knows what it is. Some people think he's being result of being blinded on the road to Damascus. Some people think it was a back problem. Some people think it was a member of his congregation, which, if you're a pastor, you can probably work out it's possibly true. But again, what does God do? Paul prays 3 times, and God doesn't say it. So does that mean Paul doesn't have enough faith? No, it doesn't. It means that Paul's thorn in his flesh, whatever it is going to be used by God, and is used by God in powerful ways. So I think we need to get away from, if you like, ableist ways of reading scripture and really open our eyes to the wonderful mystery that is revealed when we actually look from different angles and see things differently. It's releasing for all of us when that happens.
Thank you.
Oh, well, those last two questions, John, in your answers, you could really, I think, get a sense of your passion for the topic of disability in the church, which I really appreciate. Sort of on that topic as well, I'm going to call on Francis to talk about a conference that's happening at the Div College before we end our time.
So good seeing you, John, again. It's always
Absolutely,
great
Francis.
to listen to you and learn from you. And now I can tell my students, what's interesting is I just 2 days ago in my class, Disabilities in the Bible, I just talked about your idea of Jesus moving the margin. So now they know I didn't make things up. It's coming from you. So we are going to host, for those of you who are here and for those of you who join in on Zoom or on the other side of the country, MDC and a whole bunch of other organizations, it's going to host a conference called Creative Justice, Disabilities in the Church. It's part of a series that we organized. It's called Deeper Communion, in which John was the speaker probably 5 years ago in Toronto. That's probably 5-6 years ago in Toronto. So this year we have Brian Dirksen, the worship leaders, and then Dr. Amy Kenny, who wrote the book, My Body is Not a Prayer Request, as our plenary speakers. And there is a call for paper, came out like a couple of weeks ago. You can find the link to the call for paper on the chat. I just post a link there. And there will be more to follow, links to registration and whatnot. And I have to say, like, of all the academic conferences that I've been involved or been in, the Deeper Communion Conference always, I find it's always one of my favorites, because now you don't just have academics trying to bite each other's head off, but a whole bunch of people, pastors, academics, people with lived experience, join together fighting for the cause. So I highly recommend anyone who has an idea in disabilities and the church, disability theology, disabilities in the Bible, submit a paper to the conference. And this conference, it's hosted here locally at MDC, but on the other side of the country, Ambrose University will also have a session, and everything will be offered live streaming. So it's the first time that we're going to try doing a semi-national conference. So if you want any information, you can contact me. You can contact Phil Silla. Dr. Phil Silla is part of it too, but he's on research leave, so don't bother him. Any questions that you have, you can email me.
Great, thanks, Francis. And with it online, it could be an international conference as well. So there we go. So thank you again, John, for passing your time with us for the past hour. If you want to clap or whatever, you can go ahead. But we really appreciate it. We I think all appreciate the writing that you've done, both in practical theology in sort of the qualitative research end of things, as well as the practical ministry reflection that you've offered. You've been a real gift to the church. We pray blessing over your continued engagement in all of in practical theology and following your passions to help the church live faithfully in the contemporary age. So thank you again.
You're welcome. Nice to meet you all.